Okay, can you see the slides?
Okay.
Yep, okay, awesome. Yes, let me just use the... Right, so merged into another discourse around rehabilitation. And so here the idea is still that disabled people should live and work in separate environments with the overall goal of eventually being able to transition if they're able to get trained and are able to adapt to mainstream market requirements. And then there's this alternative discourse that emerged most recently, and that's the one on inclusion, building on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. And according to that model, which we call an alternative discourse because it's not based on the medical model, but rather the social model. So according to the social model, disability is a societal oppression on people with impairments. And as a result of that, it is not the people who have to change, but actually mainstream society, which is why we decided to have this uneven line to symbolize that actually mainstream society has to become inclusive. So given these different discourses, where do most disabled people in Germany nowadays work? Well, they still work in so-called, let me see if I can, in so-called sheltered workshops, and that's the setting of our study. So sheltered workshops in Germany emerged after the Second World War in order to provide people with disabilities with employment in separate facilities. And these workshops are part of a highly institutionalized welfare regime. So usually the workers are being picked up in the morning by buses. They're brought to these facilities, and you can see some of the products that they are working on. And shelter is also reflected in the physical sense. So usually these facilities are far away from the city center. And as a worker, for instance, said, shelter is reflected in the structure, routines, and continuous guidance. And then on the other hand, you have the staff, which we identified as almost the benevolent protectors of these workers. So staff, these are the account managers, social workers, psychologists, or teachers. And they said things like the workshop is a specialized facility and we are experts. So I think this very nicely illustrates how they viewed their role inside of this workshop. So when we started the study, the sheltered nature of the workshop was also reflected in the organization identity of the workshop. So at the beginning, it was all about providing rehabilitation and protective facilities. And we noticed that this organization identity also really had an effect on how the workers were viewed and how they viewed themselves. So they were viewed as eternal children, and this is only about adults, right? So it's workers, it's not about children. And they themselves reproduced that by saying things like, because I'm disabled, I need help. So what we were observing at the beginning of the study was this kind of unconscious marginalization where the ones being marginalized partly don't recognize it, and sometimes or most of the times even reproduce it. However, though, after this long period of time that we were observing this workshop, we observed a significant change in the individual identities of the workers. So at the end, they were seen as self-determined individuals, and they said things like, I'm disabled by society. And that then had a huge effect also on the organization identity of the workshop, which was in the end of the study all about inclusion. So we provide inclusion to make disabled workers part of society. And the empirical puzzle that we wanted to address is how was such a significant change in both the individual identities, but also the organization identity of the workshop possible. So if we look at the existing literature, we of course know that an organization identity is being constructed by all members inside of the organization, but we also know that often powerful leaders have more power in shaping the meaning who we are as an organization. So there's a lot of studies on how entrepreneurs, leaders, managers, or principals are shaping an organization identity. But we actually don't know a lot about the power processes that are implicit in its construction, especially where these visible forms are kind of not identifiable and absent. And while we know that an organization identity often entails the dominant capitalist or managerial discourse, and as the prior speaker also said, there's ways to fight that identity regulation. So in the most extreme way, you can have open confrontation or you can have disidentification. But mostly in the literature, there's these people talk about micro-emancipation, so fleetingly escaping everyday domination, for instance, by using humor or being cynical. But the point is that in these forms of micro-emancipation, people are not able to free themselves. They're not able to change the status quo. And of course, this gets even more difficult if you're marginalized, where in the words of Goffman, you're reduced from a full whole person to a discounted one. So we do know, of course, how marginalized individuals deal with their marginalization in society. So there are studies on that they can create a positive sense of self-worth, enhance their self-esteem, or even claim new roles. There's this very nice paper on Japanese housewives, how they were able to assume new roles in the public domain. But the point is, these studies are all at a societal level. We don't understand how marginalized individuals within an organization would be able to change the regulating organization identity. And this gets even more difficult to understand if we now focus on unconscious marginalization, where you adhere to an othering identity. So either because you don't see an alternative, you regard it as well-meaning, and in the most extreme case, you even support it. And this is where what we call benevolent marginalization comes in, which is, well-meaning, and is trying to help people, but that also makes it insidiously restrictive, as it deprives people of their agentic qualities. And if you think about it, there's a lot of different forms of this benevolent marginalization. You can see it in sexism, heterosexism, ageism, or racism. And so basically, the perpetrator believes he or she's doing something great because he's helping, and or the perpetrators don't see the discriminatory effects this can have. And the ones being disadvantaged sometimes even feel a need to be grateful for the help that they're receiving. But since there's not even an open conflict then between your identity of needing help and the protectionist organization identity, how you would be even able to recognize that and then change that regulating organization identity is really difficult to understand, and that's a theoretical puzzle that we are trying to address with the paper. So this was our research question. And if you're reading that, so how may benevolently marginalized individuals whose self-concept is tightly regulated by an organization identity collectively achieve emancipation from that infantilizing identity? I think it gets clear that we're not talking about macro emancipation in the sense of, a grand revolt. And we're also not talking about micro emancipation, but it's rather emancipation in a way of being able to free yourself from an infantilizing identity. So what we did was that we had conducted a longitudinal 6-year case study in one of the largest sheltered workshops in Germany. So this workshop has more than 2,000 employees, and in 4 different divisions. There's a manufacturing unit, a service unit, landscaping, people working in landscaping, and an organic farm. And as the previous speaker also said, for us it was very important to be able to appropriately reflect all the voices. So approximately 50% of our conversations were with disabled people. And you can see here some of the data that we collected. So overall 72 days of participant observations, and this shows you the different locations that we visited. We had interviews, informal conversations, and a lot, of course, in these 6 years, you gather a lot of archival documents, which we eventually had to narrow down to 350 that were directly relevant to understand the identity work that was going on. So we found that there were actually 3 different phases. At the beginning, it was this phase of maintaining identity constraints. So both the workers and the staff reproduced the organization identity of protection, and that also had an effect on how the workers viewed themselves. So disabled workers said, I just wouldn't be able to cope with outside pressures. And then we asked, why do you think that? And then he said, it's not only a social worker who said that, I just had my monthly catch up with my manager. And he told me some crazy stories about how we're mistreated in regular firms. And it's not like my disability is invisible. So I'm happy that I'm working in a protective environment, as this reflects who I am and what I need. So this conversation was really interesting because it shows you that the workers were referring to staff when they described their own identities and the workshop's identity. And also that the workshop's identity of this protective environment had an effect on how they viewed themselves and their own needs. And on the other hand, then the staff, as I said, they felt like the benevolent protectors. And I think this is nicely illustrated in this quote, which was an account manager. So he said, our workshop is about shelter because workers are in need of this. They are vulnerable. Yes, they need to be trained with the overall goal of adapting to outside requirements, but realistically, they will always require our protection. So this nicely shows you that, on the one hand, how they viewed their roles as the protectors and why they were important in this workshop, but it also shows you, if you think back of the different discourses, why not a lot of workers are actually able to transition to mainstream employment, because this idea of rehabilitation seems to be some vague overall goal, but the staff actually does not believe that it is achievable. In the second phase, then, we observed a significant change, though, in the identity work, and that change was initiated when a few staff who were new joiners, and they joined straight out of university, recognized that actually there was some, criticism outside of the workshop, questioning the role of workshops in German society. And while, the staff usually did not care about such criticism, the more junior staff thought, well, let's introduce some measures. Let's introduce some what we call placatory measures, such as short-term job rotations with mainstream firms, including the parents more, or offering like a social media training. And that would help that, society sees that actually our workshop makes sense and that our workers need protection. So one of these new joiners said, I think our short-term programs could benefit workers with less severe impairments, to get a sense of how it is outside, which will show them the value of our workshops facilities and our work as caregivers. And then a more seasoned worker said, I don't think it's really needed, but you go ahead. And another seasoned worker said, when you're new, you always want to bring in new ideas. In the end, they are hollow words. So this explains to you why these placatory measures were accepted by the seasoned staff, because they felt, well, it wouldn't make a difference anyways, and maybe it's like a nice marketing tool. However, though, what happened was that the participating workers actually had very positive inclusion experiences, and the participating staff and parents observed these positive experiences. And over time, a small group of what we call internal activists started to shape that developed self-determining identities for the workers. So workers said, this was like an aha moment. I've been thinking about this a lot and realized that I blindly followed others in the past. I have skills that are beneficial for society. I'm not a burden. We, and then he refers to the small internal activist group, work together to fight for our rights. So this group then wanted to reach out, of course, to other workers, but then they encountered resistance because they directly confronted them with the idea of inclusion. And then they realized that in order to reach, a critical mass of workers, they needed to recreate these positive inclusion experiences, but they also needed to personalize them in order to also accommodate the need of wanting to be protected, for instance. And they realized that they needed to recreate these kind of safe spaces where the workers felt comfortable to share their experiences. So an internal activist staff said, we need something formal where people get together. Remember when we took part in job rotations, we had these eye-opening meetings. And then an activist worker said, yes, we realized that we are all on the same page. And then another worker said, I look forward to joining. So what they did was that they had a disability board where workers felt really comfortable to share their experiences. So over time, what happened was that a critical mass started to follow this movement and started to reshape their identities. And over time, also the remaining staff got on board. But this was really, a process of confrontation, a lot of debates, because of course, the benevolent protectors, they were scared to lose their jobs. They were scared to lose their role and not being important. So what happened was that they actually reshaped their roles. And a social worker said, I've always felt like a protector, a parent. And again, remember, we're talking about adults. But my role has changed. Recently, I listened to a session of the disability board. Even workers with severe disabilities took this positive spirit from it. So I've started listening and not instructing. So the staff started to reshape their roles from being a protector to becoming an ally, an inclusion assistant. And this can help to get a critical mass of employees of the workshop on board. And in the end, they then, of course, realized that there was actually a clash in this new identity of the workers and the protective identity of the workshop. And then they started reshaping that identity towards being an inclusive organization. And this organization identity even then impacted the structures of the workshop. One of the main business units was located to the city center. There were long-term job rotations with firms. And we're in Germany here, so of course, soccer is very important, and they actually came up with a nice idea of having a soccer team of non-disabled and disabled players. And this is a quote by a non-disabled player who said, "At first, I was a bit intimidated by the disabled players. I didn't know how to behave. Through our interactions on the pitch, we've become friends. I've realized that there are people just like you and me. It's time for society to accommodate our disabled friends. If it works in soccer, why wouldn't it work everywhere else too?" So this is actually my favorite quote because it shows you that even people from outside of the workshop were then changing their view on disabled people, and there was an increased interaction because of this change that took place within the workshop. So we offer, based on these findings, we offer 3 different contributions to the literature. The first is, I've mentioned that a lot of studies focus on micro-emancipation, but that is not about changing the status quo. Well, we show that actually even marginalized individuals may be able to change the status quo if they leverage different views and priorities of powerful actors. They may then be able to question dominant discourses and establish alternative identity meanings. And through such joint work where powerful actors are recast as allies, inclusion assistants, or advocates, marginalized individuals may then be able to reshape their own identities, which precipitates a change in the organization identity. Second, while most of the literature has focused on open or hostile forms of marginalization, we actually explain how benevolent marginalization occurs and also how an emancipation process from it can be achieved. And we argue that this is not a process of open confrontation, but rather one of mutual consciousness raising and sensitization, where we define sensitization of accepting different needs of marginalized individuals, even if this is against your own belief. And lastly, while a lot of studies have focused on the role or the contentious performances of external activists, we theorize how internal activists might bring about change. And this is like collaborative work where they are able to draw on alternative discourses that are initially perceived as identity threat, but they can, if they frame these discourses broadly and reassuringly, they can actually turn them into identity opportunities, which then leads to a collective movement for change. And finally, we have some implications for practitioners, either the ones who work in protectionist organizations, but also more broadly for practitioners who are looking into introducing inclusion and diversity policies in their organizations. And we argue that we need 3 different things here. We need a change in thinking. That's the first implication. So rather than regarding marginalized individuals as being in need of help, practitioners need to regard them as worthwhile and productive, and they need to abandon their protectionist assumptions by embracing emancipatory discourses that allow for diversity of thinking. And then second, we need a change in communicating. So rather than regarding themselves as the benevolent protectors, practitioners need to change this view, and they need to regard themselves as allies and inclusion assistants who offer support in a non-didactic way. And finally, we also need a change in behavior. So rather than introducing top-down inclusion policies, what we actually need are enabling spaces or support mechanisms. So I mentioned the disability board, for instance, where marginalized individuals feel at ease to openly share their experiences and then be able to build confidence. So that concludes the presentation, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.